Hey y'all, I'm Hope, and today I want to talk about everything I read in September. This was an interesting reading month because almost everything I read was for a class, and for the most part I had a pretty good time with it. I actually was pleasantly surprised that I enjoyed most of what I read, as, you know, required reading can always be kind of a mixed bag. Sometimes you find stuff you really like, and sometimes you find things that you just really don't like, but you have to read them anyway because you have to read them. So I was pleasantly surprised this month that I really liked almost everything that I read. So the first thing I read was two plays, which are Tambourine Parts 1 and 2 by Christopher Marlowe. We read both of them together. And this was an interesting experience, partially because I've never read Christopher Marlowe before, and I sometimes struggle with this kind of era of Elizabethan drama. I'm always a little intimidated by the language used, but actually I found that this was pretty approachable, and I think this version is pretty good in terms of the notes that it has and kind of explaining anything that would be unclear to a modern audience. But this is a really interesting story because it follows Tamburlaine, who is a shepherd who decides that he's going to be the king of Persia, and later on decides he's going to be like emperor of the world. And it's about his various conquests and how he basically pushes and transgresses expected boundaries in order to become the emperor of the world. And it's interesting in part because it's sort of styled as a tragedy, but ultimately it's not that tragic for Tamburlaine. He really gets a lot of what he wants, and the ending is pretty anticlimactic based on every event that happens up to it. So I thought this was really interesting, and I'm actually thinking way too much about this right now because I'm currently writing a paper on Tamburlaine Parts 1 and 2 for the class that I read this for, which is a class on early modern embodiment, so thinking by theories of embodiment and experience, and how they can be applied to like readings of early modern drama and epic poetry. So I'm writing this paper right now that's all about like violence and subjecthood in Tamburlaine. So I've been thinking about this way too much, but I do think it is really interesting, and I think if you've only ever read Shakespeare, it is worth branching out and trying some of the other early modern dramatists, and this in particular I would recommend for its relative accessibility, I thought. For the same class, I also read The Merchant of Venice by Shakespeare. This one I've read before, so it was interesting here getting to reread it, kind of already knowing what was going to happen and getting to pay more attention to the language and the different allusions and things like that. So I really enjoyed this reread, and I think I liked this better the second time through. If you've never read The Merchant of Venice, it's about this man named Bassanio who wants to marry a woman named Portia, but he needs to get some money to travel to where she's at and like undertake this challenge that her father has set, so that whoever kind of completes this challenge properly gets to marry Portia. But he's kind of used up all of his money, and he doesn't have the funds he needs to do this, so he goes to his friend Antonio, who is a merchant, and asks Antonio for the money. And Antonio is like, I'm sorry, I don't have the money right now. However, feel free to go to anyone else that you can find that would potentially lend you money and use my name and ask them for money. So if you borrow the money, I'll pay it back in 3 months' time, and we'll just consider it as me giving you this money. Bassanio goes and he finds Shylock, a Jewish merchant who he requests the money from, and Shylock agrees. However, Shylock and Antonio hate each other because Antonio is pretty anti-Semitic, and Shylock feels that he is being discriminated against for being Jewish. He is, for sure. He's not wrong on that. But he also just like really hates Antonio, so he agrees to lend Bassanio the money. However, he wants Antonio to sign a piece of paper saying that if he can't pay back the money in 3 months' time, that Shylock will be allowed to cut a pound of flesh from him. And so Antonio, anticipating his ships returning, signs this piece of paper, and then, of course, his ships don't return. So it's about the conflict that arises from Bassanio borrowing this money from Shylock under Antonio's name. It's a really interesting play. It is definitely very anti-Semitic, so if you decide to read this one, definitely go in with that understanding. It is very uncomfortable to read at times, but I think that it is particularly interesting, I think, is that Shylock can very much be read in terms of his trying to reassert his humanity, and I think in some ways this play is very negative about the Christians as well, because you have this sense that like Shylock is trying to enact violence on Antonio, but perhaps it's deserved based on the treatment that he's received from Antonio. So I think that a lot of the arguments that Shylock makes in this play are really interesting. But yeah, definitely know going in, if you decide to read this play, that it is extremely anti-Semitic, and yeah, just very uncomfortable to read. So like I would, you know, just caution you to go in with that kind of expectation. The next thing I read was Absalom Absalom by William Faulkner, and this is the exception to my generally liking what I read. I didn't like dislike this book, but it is incredibly dense. Faulkner's writing is, he has this tendency to be like telling you something that's happened or, you know, explaining an event, and then suddenly you get this like very long philosophical passage that seems to almost have very little connection to whatever he's been talking about. It's as if the character goes on to like philosophize, whoever's currently narrating, because there are several different narrators in this book. And it's interesting, and I think there's a lot of interesting ideas in here, but it is a very dense and frustrating book to read. So like kind of in general I enjoyed the story, but there were some parts where I felt very bogged down. Particularly chapter 5 is really difficult to get through because the whole like motion of chapter 5 is somebody like trying to get up the stairs, and it goes on for like 10 or 15 pages of them just like thinking about something while trying to get up the stairs. So I think that that's a little bit frustrating to read. But this one is about this guy named Quentin who's about to go off to Harvard, and he, just before he's getting ready to leave, he's from the South. I'm trying to remember where this is set. Jefferson, Mississippi in the 1830s. It's sort of set in Jefferson, Mississippi in the 1830s, but it's also set much later than this. This was written in the 1930s. And it's following Quentin, like, decades later, being asked to come and talk to this woman, Rosa Coldfield, who wants to tell him the story of this man who came into town in the 1830s and basically ruined her family's life. It kind of starts there, and it expands quite broadly beyond that into ideas of like hunting, and there's a lot of different kinds of hunting, and there's like a haunted house, and there's a very interesting character at the center of this named Thomas Sutpen, who is kind of this strange, mysterious, violent figure who the entire narrative kind of centers on. So it's really interesting, and there's a lot that happens. I don't want to spoil any of what happens in case you do want to try reading this, because I think it is an interesting book. And kind of similarly to Tambourine, it has somebody who does a lot of like quite, not even necessarily violent, but very like self-centered things. And ultimately you would expect him to receive some sort of retribution, and that isn't quite what happens, but it is also kind of what happens. So I think this is an interesting book, and I would probably try to read Faulkner again, but I think I just was not prepared for how dense this was going to be when I went into it, because the other readings that I'd read for this class, this is a different class I'm taking on Southern Gothic literature, we hadn't encountered anything quite this dense or flowery yet. So, interesting experience. Not unenjoyable, but also not like fun to read, and definitely required more brain power than I was anticipating when I started reading it. The next thing I read was an audiobook, which was The House Across the Lake by Riley Sager. This is one of the few books that I chose to read for myself. I work as a GA, and I have a lot of time where I'm just kind of doing tedious tasks on a computer, so I'm able to listen to audiobooks while I'm doing that. And I was actually pleasantly surprised with this one, because I've previously read one other Riley Sager book, which was Final Girls, which I thought was fine. I didn't love it, I didn't hate it, I thought it was fun to listen to. But this one I actually was pleasantly surprised, as I said, because I really enjoyed this. I thought it was a very fun book. I really enjoyed listening to it. It's great for spooky season as well. But this is a really interesting thriller about a woman named Casey, who is she's an actress. And a year ago, her husband died, or a little more than a year ago, her husband died while she and he were on vacation at her family's lake house. And he drowned in the lake. She went into a depressive spiral, became an alcoholic, and has now, like 14 months later, been relegated back to the lake house by her mother as a sort of attempt to separate her from the paparazzi and give her some space to heal. But she's also like trapped in the place where her husband died. So in the midst of all of this, she meets her neighbors across the lake, Tom and Catherine Royce, when Catherine nearly drowns in the lake and Casey rescues her. So it follows the developing friendship between Casey and Catherine, and also Casey's increasing suspicions that something isn't right in the Catherine and Tom relationship, that the Royce household may not be as perfect as it seems. At the same time, she also has two other neighbors, a cop, an ex-cop named Boone, and a writer named Eli. And so they kind of get pulled into Casey's suspicions as the novel goes on. So I really enjoyed the way that this played out. I thought that Casey was a really interesting character. I think my issue when I read Final Girls was that Quincy did a lot of stupid things that didn't fit with her initial characterization. But when Casey did stupid things, because Casey does a lot of stupid things in this book, but when she did them, it made sense for who we know she is as a character. I enjoyed reading about Casey's bad decisions because it made sense for her as a character to be making those decisions, and I thought that that added a lot to the tension of the novel. Loud ass truck outside my house. Or possibly a four-wheeler, because some neighbors that ride around on four-wheelers. Anyway, I thought there was some good tension there. I really enjoyed the way that the story played out. There are a couple of twists in the latter part of the book, both of which I think are set up really well, and I disagree with some of the other reviews I've seen where some people have been kind of annoyed with one of the twists in the book because it is kind of an unusual twist. It feels a little bit strange when you get to it. However, it is set up pretty early on, and I think is set up well enough that I was actually fine with it, and I thought it was a lot of fun. I'm sorry if you can hear the four-wheeler in the background. Normally that guy isn't out riding until like in the evening, so I'm not sure what he's doing at 4:10 in the afternoon. I don't know what's going on. So then I read The Fathers by Alan Tate, which is another book I read for my class on Southern Gothic literature, and this was a really interesting experience. This is about a family, two families really. There's the Buchanans and the Posies, and the whole thing is narrated from the point of view of Lacey Buchan, who as an older man is now looking back on the history of his family and trying to kind of piece together what exactly happened to them because his family kind of fell apart. And this all happened kind of within the first year of the Civil War. So he's looking at the region that he lived in Virginia, and at his family, and trying to kind of piece together what happened. And so it's following the Buchanans as they kind of get involved with the Posies, and specifically Lacey's brother-in-law, George Posey, who married his older sister, Susan. And so it's narrated by Lacey, but looking back on himself as a 15 and 16-year-old during this time. So there's this really interesting element that we get to see Lacey's views of these things as a child, and then his later reflections on them, and he's thinking about what precisely about the values of his family or their kind of way of being in society led to their downfall. But it's interesting in part because he never really finds fault, or never fully finds fault, with either his father or George, who are kind of the patriarchs of their respective families, and it's interesting that kind of both of them are ultimately upheld as being valuable people and people who are loved, which I think is interesting. There isn't really like a bad guy in this story. So I really enjoyed reading this. It is an unusual book, but I thought it was one of the more fun texts that we've read for this class so far, and I got to write a seminar report on it, which was kind of interesting because I got to write about the different houses and how they like reflected the family's ways of interacting with others as a part of the like social networks of the region. And then the last thing that I read was another audiobook. This was Just Like Home by Sarah Gailey, and I'm finding that like Riley Sager, Sarah Gailey's, my god, I'm having trouble with that like series of syllables. Like Riley Sager's books, Sarah Gailey's books work really well for me as audiobooks to listen to while I'm working. I find that their books are really engaging, and I really enjoy Just Like Home. However, this is a book that I'm kind of not sure on my final thoughts on it, because I think I gave it 4.5 stars, and I might bump it down to a 4 because I'm forgetting parts of it already. But this is the story of Vera Crowder, who returns home when her mother calls her, and her mother is dying, and so she's going home to kind of clear out the house and prepare to sell it after her mother dies. But the important thing about Vera is that her father was a notorious serial killer, and he built this house with his own hands. And so she's returning to her family home and reflecting on her childhood there, and also at the same time dealing with the situation now where her mother is dying, and at the same time there's an artist who's trying to use pieces of their family history to create art, who's living in like the like guest cottage on the property. So there's a lot of tensions between Vera and her parents, and Vera and this artist named something. Robert? Jason? No, I don't remember his name. There's an artist, he's there. I've forgotten his name already. Anyway, there's the tensions between all of these different people interacting with the Crowder property. This was an interesting one too, because there's kind of a question through most of the book of like, is the house haunted, or is there something going on with Vera and I thought this was an interesting balance between the sense of like, is it supernatural, is it not? I really enjoyed this. I thought it was fun, and I think that there are a lot of interesting ideas in it surrounding abusive relationships and abusive cycles and the kinds of impacts that that has on a person. So I think that this one is really interesting, and I would highly recommend it. I really like Sarah Gailey's writing as well. It's very evocative in a way that I really enjoy, and I definitely want to go back and read more from their backlist because I've only read, I think, 3 of their books now. So yeah, really enjoyed that, and it was a great audiobook for spooky season. So that's all the books that I read in September, and I'd love to know what you guys read in September and what your favorite things you read were. Let me know down in the comments. Thank you so much for watching this video. If you liked it, I hope you'll consider giving it a like and maybe even subscribing to see what comes next, and I hope to see you in the next video. Bye.